Harry Potter is a franchise loved by millions, but some might not know that a lot of their fantastic beasts actually come from real-world myths and folklore. So today we're going to be looking at the inspiration for a foul-mouthed weasel species called Jarvey. And the real-world legend that J.K. Rowling used for inspiration just happens to be one of my favorite paranormal stories of all time. There's something talking in the walls and his name is Gef, here at the Insomnia Society. A cultured man named James Irving, his wife Margaret, their 16-year-old son Gilbert, and soon-to-be daughter Voiry all arrived at the farmland of Dorlish Kashen on the Isle of Man. It was their new home, beautiful but lonely, high on the hills overlooking the pastures and ocean. The building was old, with a thick cement covering its slate slab exterior, and the inside was dark due to no electricity. The low ceilings and paraffin light gave the home the feeling of a mystic's parlor. Dark brown paneled walls covered the insides, with a small gap behind them, and it's here where our story begins. In 1931, stories of the Dalby spook began to circulate the island. Gilbert had long since moved out, like their daughter Elise before, leaving Mr. Irving, Mrs. Irving, and their 13-year-old daughter Voiry living a normal life up on the hills. It began with a tapping on Sunday, September 13th. There were small scratching noises in the walls that over time turned into the spitting of a cat and the barking of a dog. Thinking an animal might have gotten in, Mr. Irving laid some traps in the ceiling. When doing so, he found an Indian ornament that belonged to him, and when he dropped it, it made a similar sound to the tappings that they had been hearing. The traps didn't work and the noises continued, and on October 20th, they got their first glimpse of the creature. A quick blur of a small rat-like body with a large bushy tail. It was yellowish in color, specked with brown and tipped in black. Voiry made the connection that the animal might be what they were hearing in the walls, and in early December, the noises became a gurgling, like that of a baby trying to speak. Mr. Irving wasn't a big believer in the supernatural, so he began to speak to it, and in little less than a week, it was speaking back full sentences. But what it said wasn't always that nice. Its voice was high-pitched and screechy, said to be 2 octaves above anything that a human could make. It would keep them up at all times of the night with loud banging against the walls and a satanic laughter emanating from the rooftop. As they walked through their gardens, they would be pelted by small stones, and as they walked through their house, they would be spit on by holes in the matchboarding. And anytime one of them would go to use the outside lavatory, the voice would shout of the person's intentions. Though he later stated he never wanted to harm the creature, Mr. Irving had moved from traps to something stronger. The family's 2 bedrooms were opposite each other at the top of the covered stairs, and in November of 1931, both were awoke to the sound of a terrible screaming. Voiry called to her father and asked what was going on, and he said he had placed some poisoned bread in the ceiling, and the creature must have gotten a hold of it. The squeals of agony lasted for 20 minutes, and later they inspected the loft, expecting to find a small animal, but there was nothing there. In a few days' time, the voice returned, mocking them that it had faked the entire thing, and to convince them it continued to make the same screams throughout the house. Voiry seemed to be the center of attention for the creature. It would stand in the walls of her room loudly proclaiming, "I am the ghost in the form of a weasel. I shall haunt you with weird noises and clanking chains," and make an awful racket of metal noises. This was the one thing that terrified Voiry, and because of this, to better protect her, in December of 1931, her parents decided to move her bed into their room. This enraged the entity, and it yelled, frothing at the mouth, that it would follow her wherever they took her. That night, when they went to sleep, they had barricaded the doors with dressers, chairs, and anything else that they could find. Soon they saw the top of the door bulging inwards with a great strength. The door held, but the strange voice called out, "I'm coming in," and a large pot of ointment kept in the room crashed against the back wall. After a few rough nights, Mr. Irving had had enough. Early in 1932, as he and Voiry were alone at the house, they noticed a cat through the window. Now, the first odd thing was, they didn't own a cat, and the second was, this cat had a short, bulldog-looking face and stripes like a tiger. Mr. Irving grabbed his rifle, and him and Voiry ran outside. They chased it into the sheep pasture, but turning into the field, it was gone. Later, when they recounted it to Mrs. Irving, the voice in the walls called out it was him that they had seen. After months of distress, the family and the creature finally called a truce. James told the creature that they couldn't move and had nowhere else to go. He asked the creature, who at this point they called Jack, why he was doing what he was doing, and Jack replied that he thought the family didn't want him there, judging by their actions before. Apologies were offered, and soon the two were living side by side. It wasn't long before the story of the Dalby spook spread from the Isle of Man to England, and a reporter for the Manchester Daily Dispatch headed to see the talking man-weasel for himself. He published his findings on January 10, 1932. Arriving at Dorish Kashen, he spoke to the Irvings and found them to be well-educated and honest people. Mr. Irving was dismayed that the activity was ruining the price of his property and attracting unwanted visitors. To attest to its validity, he also gave him names of several others that could back up the phenomena. The family was seated around the first floor, and Mr. Irving asked the creature to speak. After many unsuccessful attempts, the reporter departed, only to be stopped a short way down the walk by Mr. Irving saying he started. They tiptoed back to the door where they heard a peculiar voice like a weasel's scream. Mrs. Irving was telling Jack that the man had gone, but he protested, saying that he could hear them whispering, which Mr. Irving and the reporter were doing. Leaning into the house, the reporter could see Voyery through a mirror, seated in the kitchen sucking on a piece of string, with her mouth half obscured by her hands. The voice called out, "I will not speak to these people. They are all liars," and ceased. In a report the next day, the journalist speculated that besides Mr. Irving's theory of a hybrid animal that can talk, a normal animal had gotten into the home and Voyery was a natural ventriloquist, unconsciously giving it a voice and in the process unknowingly fooling her parents. Mr. Irving scoffed at the idea, but this was also believed by some of the townsfolk. The not always cute and cuddly Gef overheard one of these conversations from a neighboring farmer, and soon all of the man's turkeys had gone missing. When asked by Mr. Irving what happened, Gef just laughed. He was also known to be quite the thief, and he would bring back objects that caught his eye, though he would never tell them where he actually got them. They also found out that the metal noises he was making was from their stolen silverware, which he was banging on pipes in the wall. A short time after, Mr. Irving ran into two boys in his fields hunting rabbits. Returning home, he told his wife he had run into Jeff Lowry's boys, and from behind the wainscoting, a voice yelled out, "I don't like the name Jack, call me Jeff," though he could only spell phonetically, so his name became Jeff with a soft G. The family soon started leaving food out for him. They would place it on the ledge on the top of the covered stairs, which they called his sanctum, and this is where he would sleep, dance, exercise, and access the walls to the house. It should be noted that this sanctum was mainly in Voyery's room, but was able to be accessed by her and her parents thanks to the gabled roof. Gef was known to eat the lean of bacon, kippers, sausages, bananas, oranges, sweets, cream cakes, chocolates, biscuits, and more, but didn't like eggs. He also had a bad habit of talking with his mouth full. In return, he would catch rabbits for the family. These were invaluable, not just as a source for food, but the family would sell them in the nearby town of Peel for some extra income. In total, it was believed that Gef had caught 244 rabbits by 1937. And for more evidence of him being a physical being, he also got sick. On the night of April 8th, 1932, Mr. Irving was awoken to Gef telling him that he was sick. He heard the animal heaving behind the wainscoting like a cat. Apparently, Gef had broken into a cottage about 8 miles away and ate all their food, but the carrots had made him sick. He told James he had also been sick under their bed, which he checked and found to be true, and the family left him some peppermints for his stomach. Gef also had an insatiable appetite for knowledge, and seemed to pick up everything that happened in the house and beyond. He would spy on them reading the paper, and Mr. Irving would often give him lessons on different subjects. When this proved to not be enough, he would head off to different parts of the island and collect gossip and info to bring back to the Irvings. Because of this, they began to be known as uncanny throughout town, knowing things that they otherwise shouldn't about people and places. Up until this point, there was no suggestion that Gef could have been a mongoose. Everyone had been calling him a man-weasel. Then, on February 22nd of 1932, the Isle of Man Weekly Times received a letter from retired engineer Mr. W.A. Tier. About 20 years earlier, the farmer of Uri Kushlin, which sits only a few miles from Dorish Kashen, and whose family name was curiously Irving, had imported and released several mongooses in order to control the rat population. It was speculated that Gef himself might have come from one of those original 7. At one point in his journeys, Gef visited Uri Kushlin, but he said it was haunted, and being afraid of ghosts, he didn't stick around long. Gef also made claims of his origin. Sometime in 1932, the Irvings asked Gef what he was. He told them he was an Indian mongoose who was born 80 years ago in Delhi on June 7, 1852, and came this way after being chased out by the locals. But he didn't describe himself as a normal mongoose, or really anything normal at all. He had a yellow fluffy body that was long like a weasel with a large bushy tail like a squirrel. His front hands were that like a human, and this is how he was able to bang on the walls and throw things at visitors. He possessed great strength for his small size and would often push around the chair at the top of his sanctum for exercise. The story of the mongoose would soon reach the ears of Mr. Harry Price, the head of the National Laboratory for Physical Research in London, who took a great deal of interest in the case. He was having heart issues at the time, and he chose to send one of his fellow researchers and friends, Captain Harold Egerton Dennis. Captain Dennis arrived at 7:30 p.m. on February 26, 1932, and was greeted by the Irvings. They sat around the kitchen table and recounted their story as they had for others, but Gef failed to appear. At 11:30 p.m., he was leaving, and as Mr. Irving walked him out the door, they heard Gef yell from behind, "Go away! Who is that man?" They turned back into the house, but the voice stopped, and it was late, so Dennis decided to come back the next day. He did, and when he returned, Mr. Irving had laid out some rules Gef had said. First, he had to bring a camera or a gramophone for voyeury, which was a rather suspicious request. Second, he had to sit in a recess in the room. Gef had seen him and didn't like the look of him. He looked like a newsman, and Gef didn't trust newsmen. And third, Dennis also had to shout at the top of his lungs that he was a believer in Gef, as Gef himself had said he wouldn't appear for any doubting Thomas. Dennis obliged, and at 5:30 p.m., the three were interrupted by the sound of something smacking against the kettle. Upon investigating, they found a large packing needle, which Mr. Irving said was thrown by Gef. At 6:15, they heard plates moving through the scullery, but when inspecting it, there was no one there, except a small stream of liquid pouring from a hole, which Mr. Irving explained was the creature performing its natural functions. At 7:20 p.m., Mrs. Irving returned from Peel. Mr. Irving asked her and Voyeury if they could go upstairs and see if they could get Gef talking. Soon the men below heard a terrible screeching voice, and Captain Dennis asked if it would come down and speak with him. It yelled back, "No, I don't mean to stay long as I don't like you." Wary it might be a trick, he tried to slowly sneak up the stairs, but slipped in the dark and Gef screamed, "He's coming!" and went silent for the rest of the night. So here's another theory. Mrs. Irving, like her husband, was well cultured and thought to be the real head of the family in a quiet, matriarchal way. She was described by others as having a witching effect on the soul and eyes that could pierce through you. She also fancied herself a psychic, and on more than one occasion, Gef referred to her as the witch woman, though he would often call her ma'am because she was the one that gave him food. Voyeury, on the other hand, was upbeat and loved to travel the fields with her dog Mona. She was an expert rabbit catcher and had a fascination with machines, which was very similar to Gef's interests. But she was also a teenager in an isolated location and was only one of 12 in her class. So the theory goes that the farm life not for them, the two devised a plan to scare Mr. Irving into selling the place. But if that was their plan, it backfired because no one wanted to buy a now haunted house. Mr. Price kept up correspondence with Mr. Irving in between Dennis's visits, and Mr. Irving shared with him an almost daily diary of Gef's doings. With all of the fantastical activity happening, he was determined to visit for himself. Gef seemed almost afraid that one of the leading paranormal investigators in the country would be coming to see him. Captain Dennis he liked, but Price was much more of a skeptic and had a habit of putting the kibosh on spirits, as Gef put it. Due to the nature of the case, and wanting someone to back up his research, he contacted his friend Richard Stanton Lambert, an employee of the BBC and founding editor of Listener magazine. They contacted Mr. Irving about their visit, and he told them Gef had been missing for some time, which wasn't uncommon as he was known to make excursions on the Isle, but Price and Lambert thought it had something more to do with their coming visit. Arriving at 6:45 p.m., Tuesday, July 30th, 1935, they met the family, but Gef didn't want to show himself. At this point in their relationship, Mrs. Irving had gotten annoyed with Gef, making them look like liars. She gave a heartfelt speech to the walls, asking him to show himself. And later, Price and Lambert both remarked that if she was faking it, then she had to have been a world-class actress. But Gef didn't show himself. After comparing notes, the two noticed that it was Mr. Irving that seemed to be doing all of the speaking, and Voiry, who was the center of the phenomena, was reserved and barely said a word at all. Wanting to speak to her alone, they devised a plan to take a driving tour of the northern part of the island. Mr. Irving agreed only if he could come, which ruined their plans. So, without any good evidence, the two returned home. Soon, their relationship began to sour, as Mr. Irving hadn't liked the way that his wife and Voiry had been displayed with unsmiling and dour photographs in Price's article. In the piece, Price also hinted at some of his suspicion of fraud, with his untested theory being that the space behind the paneling could act as some sort of resonating chamber, able to carry a voice from one part of the house to another. Dennis, who was still in good standing with the Irvings, made another visit a few months after Price on the 2nd of October of the same year, and his experience was entirely different. He arrived at 5:30 p.m. and the Irvings told him that Gef had been speaking all morning and seemed to be in a good mood. At 9:30 p.m., they heard the geese begin to make a racket in the garden. This was a common sign of the approaching of Gef, which was odd since the chickens and Mona didn't seem to notice his presence. Around 11 p.m., Voiry went to bed. About a half an hour later, they heard a few knocks in the house. Mr. Irving called for Gef, and in response, there was a series of different knocks, followed by a door slamming shut with great force. Dennis suggested that they see what happened, and a shrill voice yelled, "Go and look!" They approached Voiry's room and saw the latch of her door was still locked. This was often done to prevent her from sleepwalking. They checked that she was alright, relatched the door, and went to wait for more activity. Shrill screams accompanied by loud bangs emanated from all parts of the house in quick succession. The bangs seemed to come from the roof, the Irving's room, and on the staircase. This was followed by a large crash upstairs. Running into Voiry's room, they saw Gef's exercise chair had fallen partly onto her bed and partly onto the dresser. Voiry was awake but unalarmed, remarking that this was normal behavior for Gef. They returned to the fire and the voice came again. Gef proceeded to whistle like a train, count down numbers, and when Dennis asked him to get closer, there was a loud bang from behind the wall which shook the pictures. Anyone who had ever experienced this banging noise always remarked that it was louder than any mongoose could make. This ability was what Gef referred to as his magic. Still interested in the phenomena, but with relationships now sour, Price had come up with a plan. A short time after Dennis's last trip, he sent fellow researcher Nora Nichols to Dorlish Kashen under the false name of Miss Culhane. She arrived in February of 1936, and Mr. Irving was overly suspicious of any connection she had with Price. She didn't experience Gef on her visit, but by this time, in early 1936, the novelty of Gef had worn off for the two women of the household. Originally almost inseparable from Voiry, as she grew older their bond diminished, and now it was Mr. Irving that was spending all of his time with Gef. He had even taken to calling Mr. Irving Potts as a nickname, which Gef said he based off a character in a Daily Express cartoon. But weirdly enough, this is the same nickname as Martha in the Bell Witch Haunting. The next, and perhaps most interesting visitor to Dorlish Kashen was a man by the name of Nandor Fodor. He belonged to the International Institute for Physical Research, was assistant editor of the spiritualist journal Light, and worked in psychoanalytical research. He had tried to visit, but over the last 9 months, Gef's surly behavior and unwillingness to talk to guests stopped them from inviting anyone over. He spoke to one of their good friends, Charles Morrison, and was eventually allowed to visit. Fodor arrived, accompanied by Morrison, on the 1st of February 1937. He had brought gifts for Gef, and a camera he had hoped to rig for Gef to take a photo of himself. They removed the covering above Gef's sanctum, which covered the hole where he was said to access the roof, and pulling the nails removed another board, just enough for Fodor to fit his head through. Inside, he found a nest of grass, thought to be Gef's bed, and 3 rubber bouncing balls that he liked to play with. He noticed the space inside would only be able to fit a small child, and they wouldn't be able to move around, but it would make a good home for an animal. He set his contraption, which involved a set of weights connected to a camera and a flashlight so that when pressure was applied it would take a photo. Though sadly this would never work. Mr. Irving also showed him the area where Gef had stuck his fingers through the wall. There were 3 on each hand, and they were yellow in color. All 3 of the family members were present, and Voiry had even touched them, commenting on how cold and hard they were. The caption of the photo is how Gef showed his hands, but we're not told whose hands those are, creepy enough. Fodor was staying in the house, unlike the others who all stayed at the local inn. Around 10:30 p.m., he settled into a corner of the parlor where he heard a rustling noise, but couldn't see anything in the dark. They checked the next morning, but the gifts that he had left in Jeff's sanctum were untouched. Irving explained to Fodor that them and Gef were currently at odds. He would often taunt them that he may leave and never come back, that there were much nicer houses than this one that he could sneak his way into. In October 1936, he said he was going to visit Ballamore, a mansion near Jarvey, some 20 miles away, which, since he was now old and lazy, he hitched a ride on a cart to. The next day he returned to describe the house to them in vivid detail, even down to the ornamental fireplace covered in lions. Gef also named the current owners, the owners before them, and the previous owner before that one, as well as the name of the family living in the attached farmhouse. Morrison called the mansion on behalf of Fodor and spoke to Mrs. Ward, the named owner of the farmhouse. She confirmed that the details were true and told the owner of the house who invited them over. Fodor hired a car, and him, Morrison, Mr. Irving, and Voiry arrived at the mansion, where Mrs. Ward greeted them as the spooky people. They went over the account of what Gef had described to them, and out of 30 distinct observations, only 3 were wrong, with 20 perfect and 7 partially. When asked about the lion fireplace, the owners laughed and said there was no such thing, but on inspection, Fodor noticed it was covered in a lion motif. The owners were shocked and had never noticed it before, and another odd detail they found was that Mrs. Ward had owned a tame mongoose as a child. Fodor's main objective on the island was to make sure everyone's stories lined up. With the help of Morrison, he was in contact with Henry Hall, who was 19 at the time of the interview. In 1933, he and his cousin Will Cubbin had visited the house for the first time. The boys played the penny trick with Gef. It involved placing a penny either face up or face down in the crack above the window in pitch black. While no one could see it and everybody was seated at the table, Gef would then call out the right answer, which he attributed to his amazing eyesight. The only times he was ever wrong, he pretended like he was doing it on purpose, though this wasn't often. Gef proceeded to sing and joke around with the boys, acting like a young street urchin. The boys also said that they thought they had seen him. A few days later, a few miles from their home, they saw a small yellow animal with a flat face. It was close to a hedge and running fast. Though it didn't speak, it looked regretful that it had been seen. They described it looking like a squirrel with the way it carried its tail over its back, but there aren't any squirrels native to the Isle of Man. Will Cubbin was also interviewed and gave the same story. But perhaps the most interesting is the story from Morrison's son Arthur. He went to Dorlish Kashen in March 1932 to expose the whole thing as a hoax. He arrived around 5 p.m. and Gef called out hello, so he called back. Gef told him that he originally didn't like him, but he was alright now, followed by knocks all over the house and a vanished from Gef. Later on, Gef sang a Scottish song and thumped in time on the walls. Getting bored, he said he was going to the Kellys to find some juicy gossip. Asking Arthur, he still thought it was a trick, and they went to bed for the night. In the morning, he was rudely awoken by Gef, but still thinking it was Voiry, he didn't pay any attention. He was in the kitchen with Mr. Irving when there was a thwack on the board behind his head, which scared him half to death, and then the patter of animal feet on the boards above him. Voiry had been outside near the stockyard, and Mrs. Irving was in Peel at the time, and he had no other explanation than to think it was real. Fodor returned from his visit with only 2 loud bangs as evidence, but based on those he spoke to, he believed it was possibly true. But was it true? In early 1934, it was suggested by Irving to Price that they try and get footprints of Gef. Strangely enough, Gef was excited with the idea, and Price sent plasticine to the Isle. After a few days of trying, Gef was able to create these. They were sent to London to be analyzed, and here's what they found. The first thing is that the front right hand on the top left and right is significantly bigger than the rear paw at the bottom center. This would make sense with Gef's human-like hands. The teeth prints give them the impression of an animal about a foot long, and when asked why there was no bottom jaw, Gef told them that he didn't put it in his mouth like a piece of bread, but put his teeth down on it. And lastly, that the impressions didn't show any wrinkles or markings, indicating that they had been made with something smooth. With less than favorable results, they moved on to something else. On Christmas 1934, it was suggested that they try and photograph Gef. He originally declined, with his fear of being seen, but eventually allowed Voyery to take his photo. Dennis sent money for a camera rental, but when it came time to take it, Gef refused and left for a few days. Eventually, there were a few images that were captured, but these were inconclusive. This subversion went on until December 1935, when one of the most famous images of Gef was captured. They've been the center of many debates, and some think it was a ploy by Voyery to finesse a high-end camera off the researchers. Something else they got was hair samples. In March 1935, Gef was kind enough to produce some for them. He pulled them off his back, tail, and its tip and left them in a bowl for the Irvings. They sent these to Price, and he sent them to M.F. Martin Duncan, Fellow of the London Zoological Society. He studied the hairs and came to the conclusion that they didn't come from any sort of mongoose or weasel-like creature, but that of a longish-haired dog. Sadly, they didn't have too many domestic dog hairs in-house to pull from. He also noticed that they had been cut, not pulled like Gef had said. Before Price was able to collect his own samples, Gef sent along 2 more rounds of hair, with these having the same conclusion as the first. When Price collected samples from their dog Mona, they were almost identical, but does this rule Gef out as a hoax? He's been known as a trickster, shapeshifter, and has many similarities to a poltergeist, so could he have been faking it to keep his identity a secret? When asked about the hair, he responded that Price does not think, should not know, and very well does not know what he is. By 1939, Gef's excursions away became longer and longer, and Voyery had moved out to take a job as a machinist. The final word that we have about Gef is a vaguely fitting one. In 1942, it was reported that the tappings in Dorlish Kashen were back, though Gef didn't feel like company this time, and would all visitors please stay away. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you think the Gef the Mongoose case was real or a hoax in the comments below. And if it was a hoax, how do you think they faked it? Make sure to hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell so you never miss another episode. It gets weird out there, so stay safe, guys.